What really happened behind Dubai's glittering facade? And why did this particular appearance trigger one of the most intense palace crises in years? In the early morning hours, rumors coalesced into an explosive mix. A trip officially deemed to have no political significance developed into an international sensation within hours. Meghan Markle's stay in Dubai was not seen in internal circles as a typical PR event, but as a calculated move with far-reaching consequences. Observers spoke of a moment in which private ambitions, public perception, and institutional boundaries clashed head-on. Speculation began shortly after the trip was announced. Why Dubai? Why now? Why without a clear explanation? As images circulated and headlines escalated, nervousness grew behind the scenes. The visit was interpreted as a symbol of independence, of transgressing boundaries, of a deliberate break with tacit agreements. Within palace circles, the impression solidified that this was not just a trip, but a test of the limits of institutional patience. The timing of the trip was particularly explosive. It fell during a period of escalating tensions, marked by legal disputes, relentless media scrutiny, and internal concerns about stability. Dubai thus became a projection screen for everything that had been building up. The accusation, though not explicitly stated, was clearly implied. Royal symbolism was being exploited without regard for long-term consequences. A single appearance became a political issue. A narrative of provocation quickly took hold in the public eye. Commentators questioned whether this move had been a deliberate choice to maximize attention or exert pressure. Others saw it as an attempt to forge new alliances, far removed from traditional checks and balances. The dynamics of social media played a significant role. Within hours, a digital storm erupted, reigniting old conflicts and dragging previously internal debates into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. Simultaneously, the focus shifted. It was no longer solely about an individual or a controversial appearance, but about the question of responsibility. Who bears it when private actions impact institutional structures? This is precisely where the escalation began. The trip was perceived as a catalyst, suddenly bringing latent anxieties to the surface. The discussion shifted from matters of style to fundamental questions about boundaries, loyalty, and duty of care. Observers were particularly sensitive to the fact that family aspects increasingly faded into the background. Critical voices questioned whether personal decisions were still in line with overriding obligations. For the first time, the children visibly moved into the center of the debate, not as participants, but as the point of reference for moral argumentation. What had previously been abstract suddenly acquired a concrete emotional dimension. At its core, the image of a turning point emerged. Dubai became synonymous with the moment when internal warning signals had been ignored. The unspoken but ever-present accusation was one of acting unilaterally. This perception intensified the willingness to discuss consequences that had previously seemed unthinkable. Within a very short time, reticence transformed into a compulsion to act. Thus, this stay marked the beginning of a new phase. Not because of a single event, but because it brought together numerous conflicts. Dubai became a symbol of loss of control, of an escalation between individual self-promotion and institutional self-assertion. The crucial question was no longer what had happened, but what the consequences should be. Ultimately, a realization emerged that determined the course of events. This performance could not remain without repercussions. It had crossed a threshold beyond which mere symbolic politics were no longer sufficient. What began as a trip became the trigger for a process that would reorganize power structures, responsibilities, and loyalties. And it was precisely here that the next stage of escalation began, prompting the institution's own response. With the growing outrage over the Dubai performance, a phase of concentrated activity began behind closed doors, the intensity of which surprised even seasoned observers. While public speculation about motives continued, a sober reassessment took place internally. The focus shifted away from media headlines and toward structural questions. What responsibility did the institution bear, and where did it have to intervene to prevent further damage? The reaction was not impulsive, but strategically driven by the awareness that inaction could be interpreted as acquiescence. At the heart of these considerations was King Charles II. As head of state and a symbol of institutional continuity, he felt compelled to provide clarity. The events were not viewed in isolation, but analyzed as part of a longer development. Internally, there had already been concerns that private activities were increasingly being linked to royal symbolism without formal coordination. The Dubai engagement confirmed these concerns and accelerated decision-making processes that had previously only been discussed theoretically. Princess Anne played a pivotal role in this phase. Her reputation as a level-headed, principled figure lost weight in the debate. She insisted that the focus should not be solely on public impact, but also on long-term consequences. In her view, the incident had crossed a line because it not only touched upon the institution but actively challenged it. This assessment shaped the subsequent course of action and reinforced the consensus that a clear response was unavoidable. In parallel, a legal working group was formed, tasked with examining existing agreements, informal arrangements, and legal gray areas. The goal was to identify courses of action that were both legally sound and politically acceptable. It became clear that previous compromises were now perceived as weaknesses. What had once been considered a pragmatic solution suddenly appeared as an invitation to expand private freedoms. Prince William emerged as a driving force in this context when it came to safeguarding institutional credibility. His position was characterized by the conviction that the monarchy could only endure if clear boundaries were drawn. Discussions increasingly revolved around the protection of future generations and the question of how responsibility could be visibly exercised. The issue of children gained a new urgency, not as a media narrative, but as a moral obligation. Princess Catherine was also included in these considerations. Her role was less confrontational, but no less influential. She brought a perspective of stability and care and drew attention to the long-term consequences of constant unrest. Internal documents increasingly revealed concerns that ongoing conflicts could damage not only the public image but also the children's personal lives. This argument intensified the pressure to develop structural safeguards. The tone within the institution shifted noticeably. Where restraint had previously prevailed, resolve now took hold. The focus was no longer on mediating conflicts but on regaining control. The Dubai appearance was retrospectively defined as a turning point, a point at which symbolic distance was no longer sufficient. Instead, a strategy emerged that relied on formal clarifications and institutional self-assertion. Little of this process reached the public eye. But behind the scenes, a scenario was being prepared that would have far-reaching consequences. The question was no longer whether a response was necessary, but how comprehensive that response should be. Caution had transformed into resolve, and waiting had become a structured counterattack. This paved the way for the next step, a concrete focus on those at the center of the debate who were not being heard themselves. With the institutional reorganization, the focus of the debate shifted to those who had previously only been mentioned in passing. Now Archie and Lilibet moved into the spotlight. In internal assessments, they were no longer seen merely as a familial point of reference, but as a central variable in an escalating situation. The question of how their role was perceived publicly and privately became a crucial touchstone. What had initially been formulated as a protective argument now took concrete form and became the basis for further action. Observers noted that the children had increasingly become part of a public narrative without having any influence over it. Names, pictures, and symbolic attributions appeared in contexts that extended far beyond the private sphere. This development was viewed internally as problematic, as it suggested a blurring of familial identity and public exploitation. Concern grew that long-term consequences were being underestimated, and that short-term attention could come at the expense of personal stability. The term instrumentalization appeared repeatedly in the internal documents. This referred not to a single action but to a pattern. The children appeared as a projection screen for expectations, hopes, and political interpretations. This perception reinforced the impression that a boundary had been crossed. What was once considered a symbolic connection was now classified as a risk that required active management. The discussion thus took on a new quality, extending beyond familial issues. Simultaneously, the tone of the public debate shifted. Commentators began to speak less about personal conflicts and more about responsibility. The question of the environment in which children should grow up gained importance. In this context, it was increasingly emphasized that stability was not only a private concern but also a public good when it came to individuals of symbolic significance. This argument lent additional legitimacy to internal considerations. Within the institution, the view took hold that inaction could be interpreted as neglect. The children became the moral reference point against which the institution's capacity for action could be measured. This perspective fundamentally altered the dynamics. Decisions previously considered politically sensitive now appeared as necessary protective measures. The debate shifted from the question of jurisdiction to the question of duty. At the same time, it became clear how closely the public perception of the children was linked to the overall picture of the crisis. Every new report, every speculation reinforced the impression of a situation without clear safeguards. The institution was thus confronted not only with protecting its own reputation but also with establishing a minimum level of order. Archie and Lilibet symbolically represented this task, without being agents in their own right. This development led to a paradoxical situation. The more strongly it was emphasized that the children had to be protected, the more present they became in the discourse. Internally, this was recognized as a dilemma that required careful balancing. The solution could not lie in greater publicity but in clear, discrete structures. This is precisely where the next stage of escalation began, increasingly focused on control and self-interest. At the end of this phase, a fundamental reassessment took place. The children were no longer considered a peripheral issue but a core concern. Their situation brought together moral, institutional, and political aspects at a point where evasion no longer seemed possible. This realization paved the way for decisions that would determine not only the present but also the future direction. While the focus increasingly shifted to Archie and Lilibet, Prince Harry himself became the central figure in the evaluation, not as an active shaper, but as an absent figure whose silence resonated louder than any statement. Internal assessments redefined his role, less as a balancing factor and more as a variable of uncertainty. The question was no longer what position he publicly adopted, but why he failed to demonstrate any discernible stance at all. Observers described a period of increasing disorientation. Prince Harry appeared isolated, both physically and emotionally, and his absence from crucial moments reinforced the impression of a loss of control. In a situation where clarity was expected, he remained invisible. This vacuum was perceived as problematic because it allowed room for speculation and further deepened institutional uncertainty. Silence was not interpreted as neutrality, but as withdrawal. Within the institution, concern grew that this passivity could have long-term consequences. Prince Harry had long been seen as a link between personal freedom and institutional affiliation. Now this very function seemed to be eroding. Internal analyses painted a picture of a man torn between loyalties and thus appearing paralyzed. This perception intensified the pressure on other actors to assume responsibility. The discussions took on a more sober tone. Emotional explanations receded into the background, while structural assessments dominated. The focus shifted from personal motives to consequences. Prince Harry's indecisiveness was seen as a factor that exacerbated existing tensions and created new risks. This development was considered particularly alarming with regard to the children, as a lack of guidance could be interpreted as a form of neglect. Simultaneously, public perception shifted. Media reports portrayed a man in retreat, unable or unwilling to visibly assume responsibility. This narrative acted as a catalyst for further criticism. The longer the silence persisted, the more entrenched the impression became that decisions had to be made elsewhere. The institution felt compelled to factor this dynamic into its calculations. Internally, there was increasing talk that Prince Harry's role needed to be reassessed, not as a punitive measure, but as a consequence of his de facto absence. The question of whether he was still capable of actively contributing to the protection of his children was raised. These considerations marked a break with previous assumptions that had relied on mediation and patience. At the end of this phase came a sobering realization. The hesitation had come at a price. Prince Harry's indecisiveness exacerbated the crisis instead of mitigating it. For the institution, this meant it could no longer rely on individual resolutions. Attention now turned to those willing to assume responsibility and create structures where personal leadership was lacking. This paved the way for coordinated action by those who were no longer willing to wait. With the growing understanding that individual hesitation would not resolve the crisis, those actors prepared to act collectively came to the fore. Princess and Prince William and Princess Catherine formed the strategic center of this new phase. Her approach was less emotional than determined, driven by a desire to establish order where ambiguity prevailed. The situation had reached a point where coordination seemed more important than consideration. Princess Anne assumed a leading role in structuring the next steps. Her stance was characterized by clarity and left little room for interpretation. She viewed the situation not as a family conflict, but as an institutional challenge with long-term consequences. This perspective diminished the weight of individual assessments and created a common basis for further action. In internal evaluations, it was seen as a guarantee that decisions would be made on principle, not out of short-term pressure. Prince William acted as the operational driving force. His arguments focused on credibility and accountability. He was convinced that the institution could only remain effective if it visibly fulfilled its protective function. He insisted on defining clear responsibilities and taking irreversible measures. This stance marked a departure from previous attempts to diffuse conflicts through distance. Princess Catherine added a stabilizing element to this approach. Her focus was on continuity and care, without losing sight of the institutional perspective. In internal discussions, she addressed the long-term effects of uncertainty and emphasized the importance of reliable structures. Her contributions lent the measures a human dimension that went beyond a mere demonstration of power. Together, they developed an approach that emphasized control and protection without escalating the situation publicly. The goal was to create a framework that minimized future risks. It became clear that this was not about symbolic gestures, but about sustainable mechanisms. The discussions revolved around supervisory responsibility and the question of how stability could be guaranteed in the long term. The collaboration of these three actors noticeably changed the dynamics. Where uncertainty had previously prevailed, there was now decisiveness. The institution presented itself as united and capable of action. This unity was seen internally as a crucial turning point, as it demonstrated that leadership was present. The external signal was clear. The wait-and-see phase was over. At the same time, there was a growing awareness that every decision would have consequences. Those involved agreed that a clear course of action was necessary, even if it might provoke resistance. The priority was on protecting the children and maintaining institutional integrity. This emphasis determined the subsequent course of action and set standards for future steps. At the end of this phase, a clear direction had been established. Princess and Prince William and Princess Catherine had assumed control and set the framework for a reorganization. Their cooperation symbolized the transition from reactive to proactive policy. The question was no longer whether action would be taken, but how far-reaching these decisions should be. This brought the final chapter of this crisis within reach. With a united front presented by the leading actors, the crisis reached its decisive phase. The lines hardened, and a simmering conflict became a clear rift between family and institution. What had long been treated as an internal matter was now defined as a structural problem demanding definitive answers. The events of the past weeks culminated in a point where a return to the old arrangements no longer seemed realistic. Sober assessments dominated this phase. The institution no longer viewed the situation as a temporary escalation, but rather as a symptom of a fundamental imbalance. private decisions had repeatedly generated institutional consequences without the enforcement of binding rules. The resulting loss of control was now openly acknowledged. This clarity marked a turning point that extended far beyond the immediate incident. The debate shifted to the question of sustainability. What structures needed to be established to prevent similar crises in the future? It became clear that symbolic distance alone would not suffice. Instead, formal dividing lines moved into focus. The institution signaled its willingness to redefine responsibility and clearly delineate jurisdictions, even if this strained family ties. The narrative of a definitive break intensified in the public sphere. Observers spoke of a moment of self-assertion in which the institution reordered its priorities. The protection of children and the maintenance of institutional integrity were portrayed as incompatible with continued ambiguity. This line of reasoning undermined the legitimacy of the decisions and reduced the scope for compromise. At the same time, it became clear that the break should not be understood as an act of punishment, but as a necessary consequence. The institution presented itself not as reactive, but as proactive. The focus was on the future and on the question of how stability could be restored. This perspective shaped the final assessments and lent them a strategic character. In the end, a clear message emerged. The transition phase was complete. The institution had drawn its line and thereby established a new order. This order was based on clear responsibilities, reduced ambiguity, and a renewed self-understanding. The crisis had left its mark, but it had also led to a readjustment. With this decision, a circle was completed. What had begun as a journey ended in a fundamental redefinition of closeness and distance. The institution emerged from the crisis stronger, while familial bonds were re-evaluated. The open questions now concerned the future more than the past. What role would responsibility, loyalty, and protection play going forward? And how would this new equilibrium prove itself? The escalation surrounding the Dubai engagement marked the beginning of a crisis that extended far beyond a single incident. A trip became a catalyst, exposing existing tensions and revealing institutional weaknesses. Initial reticence gave way to a strategic reassessment centered on responsibility and protection. The role of children, in particular, became the moral benchmark against which the ability to act could be measured. As events unfolded, it became clear that individual indecisiveness exacerbated the dynamics. The silence and withdrawal of certain actors created a vacuum that others had to fill. Princess and Prince William and Princess Catherine presented a united front and assumed leadership. Their approach was characterized by clarity, coordination, and a commitment to creating sustainable structures. In doing so, they transformed the nature of the crisis from a reactive confrontation to a proactive restructuring. The final phase was marked by a clear separation. Family and institution were no longer considered synonymous, but rather spheres with different logics and obligations. This dividing line made it possible to make decisions that had previously been deemed too far-reaching. The institution redefined its protective function, thereby setting standards for future cases. Ultimately, a consolidated order emerged from the crisis. The events raised fundamental questions. How much individual freedom can institutional responsibility tolerate? Where are the boundaries between personal self-realization and public duty? And what lessons can be learned from this escalation to prevent similar conflicts in the future? These questions remain open and invite discussion about power, responsibility, and the price of stability.